So just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Marc Fungard. I'm the head of research and analytics within financial crime threat mitigation within compliance at HSBC. And so what does that all mean? What does that do? Essentially what our function is really about is providing insight so the bank can make the right decisions about financial crime. We do that qualitatively and we do it quantitatively. And quantitatively, we increasingly do using machine learning and AI, and so we'll talk a little bit about that today. Within the function, we've got a wide variety of skills, always looking for people in those wide variety of skills, and, from the cutting edge kind of R&D data scientist all the way to engineers and people doing that kind of work, and then qualitative analysts to help explain in context what this all might mean. And so, being here at CogX and us all being sort of enthusiastic about machine learning and AI, you might be expecting me to say that, big data and AI are the obvious case-closed solution to all things financial crime. And they're certainly a huge help, but in reality, I think the answer is a bit more nuanced, and I'll talk a bit about that. Before I come to how that actually works, though, maybe I'll talk a little bit about kind of what financial crime is and kind of the problem we face, because it'll help us kind of understand the discussion in context. So in bank terms, financial crime is people using the financial system to separate the proceeds of crime from the underlying criminal activity in a way that tries to hide the source and then appears to make it legitimate. So this can start within the financial system itself, like fraud, or it could be the profits from otherwise illegal activity, human trafficking, narco trafficking. We talked at the HSBC stage yesterday about wildlife trafficking, or any other kind of criminal activity. And in order to accomplish what they're trying to accomplish, criminals need to be able to move their money at scale, at speed, across borders without being caught. And the way they seek to do that is by avoiding detection. And the way they seek to do that is by hiding their proceeds in plain sight amidst the legitimate global funds flows. And that is where the machine learning and AI bit starts to come in. So technology today makes it far easier to make payments than it's ever been in history. All of us today during the panel could probably take a device out of our pocket and make a payment to somewhere else in some other part of the world while sitting and listening to me give the speech. Please don't do that. I hope the speech is all right. And so if you think about that at HSBC's scale, with us in 66 countries, with 39 million clients, what that really means is we see, on average, about 650 million payments per month. So if you do the maths, give or take about 8 billion payments a year. And that creates a massive amount of data for criminals to try to hide in, and a massive amount of data for us to leverage to actually look to solve the problem. But fundamentally, whether it's anywhere in these transactions, whether it being taken by the most advanced technology we have now, or simply someone coming in and speaking to a cashier, we're trying to do the fundamentally same thing, which is identify those payments and that activity that doesn't look right and that might indicate that something untoward's kind of taking place. So let me talk for a minute about kind of how we do that now. Until recently, I think most banks have been broadly trying to do the same thing with relatively dated technology to try to find signs of financial crime. We break the problem down into component parts and take bits of our data and try to apply different tools to look for different aspects of the problem. And that's a mixture of systems, and we look at historic data to spot things, as well as the subject matter expertise of our staff, and of course, information we get from law enforcement and other institutions as we talk about what it is we should be looking for. Within that, then, we identify a subset of activity that we think might be worth looking further at. And we might think it's fraudulent, we might think it's money laundering, it might have other kind of typologies that we think are worth looking. And then we employ analysts and investigators to go in and dig into that in more detail to determine essentially whether or not this is legitimate. At the end of that process, we then make a report to the relevant agency of the government in the jurisdiction we're in the UK here, that's the National Crime Agency. And that's kind of how that process tends to work. It's not, as you can imagine, and as you can hear me describing it, an overly efficient way to go about it. The approaches that get used are very often rules-based, and they create a large number of false positives. And then those false positives are then whittled down through that process I was just talking about with analysts and investigators And that has a couple of negative impacts. One, it negatively impacts our customers as we sort of have to slow everything down and kind of look at it and make sure it works. Or it also creates a relatively expensive and labor-intensive process whereby we're putting a lot of time and effort to find out what we shouldn't be looking at. And so I think if you think about that overall, what you get to is to say, of the large number of investigations that we actually do, only a very small fraction of those actually get reported. And then of those, only a small portion get investigated. And, globally, it's reported that essentially less than 1% of illicit proceeds actually ever get seized. So as you think about that, it seems like there has to be a more effective and more efficient way to kind of tackle that problem. And like I said, this is the part where AI and machine learning come in. At core, everything I've just described and everything we're trying to do, financial crime detection that is fundamentally a pattern recognition problem. You're trying to find people who are trying to make their transactions look like everybody else's, but fundamentally they're not. And if we can differentiate those that are not normal, or that could be anomalous or problematic, you can then better target what you're looking at and spend more of the time and effort looking for the things we should be focused on. The complications with this is that transactions look broadly similar. You have a sender, you have a recipient, you have a sending bank, you have a receiving bank, and you have some notion of a payment purpose in between. And there's millions to look through daily, and criminal transactions are a tiny portion of that. So it's not a needle in a haystack problem, it's a needle in a stack of needles problem. So differentiating that potentially criminal activity from the legitimate transactions means we have to understand the context of the payment. We have to, and ideally considering a range of factors. So, for example, a large transaction in any one account could be a huge fraud. It could be someone attempting to drain the account. Or it could be someone paying a solicitor to buy a house. And if you create a rule that says, show me every payment above a certain level, you'll catch both of those. And there, thankfully, are more people buying houses than there are conducting fraud. In HSBC, we're trying to turn then to new techniques to leverage these data sets and use AI and machine learning to establish that context. And essentially we're using it to look for patterns, look for anomalies, look for outliers. And at core, all of these techniques then try to find essentially the same three questions, which is who's this customer, what are they doing with their money, and does that make sense? Ultimately, criminals are quite sophisticated. They know that the existing systems we use look for various flags, they look to avoid them, and they're constantly trying to find ways around them. So, for example, back to my one large payment, maybe they make lots of small ones instead of one large one. But I think with AI and machine learning, what we're finding is it gives us a much more sophisticated view of the problem, a much more contextual view of the problem. And we can consider, for example, not just the activity of a customer and what they're doing, but we can consider it in the context of all the other customers who look like that, who transact like that, who behave like that. Or we can look for outliers and changes as compared to previous behavior across a time series. We can also then look at other data sources that we can bring in and use that to kind of draw things together. And that ultimately is making us much better at working out which among the millions of legitimate transactions we process, where someone is trying to move criminal money. So let me give you kind of two examples of sort of how we do that today using some of the more advanced techniques. One particular tool we use is called our Global Social Network Analysis tool, where we're combining bank data and external data, such as company ownership information, and bringing that together to identify networks and links between customers and transactions. So you can imagine here, one person making a transaction to someone else who is on the board of a company who's then transacting back to another company, which the first person is on the board of. You start to see a network emerge there across various data sets. And what this does is it gives the investigator a powerful capability to look at the activity in the context of everything else that we kind of know about that network, to help identify activities and relationships which either on their face didn't seem suspicious and then become so because you're looking at the broader network, or vice versa, that on its face looks sort of problematic, but when you look at the broader network, you can explain why that might be the case. That's built on a framework of kind of well-known open source coding languages. It's the stuff that most, meat and bread to most data science teams. We're using in that, again, back to the scale issue, we're using about 40 billion different data points to construct the diagrams, and we're referencing over 30 billion financial transactions. So that's kind of the one around networks and social networks. The other one that we're working on is what we call our Cognitive Investigator tool, or CogI, which helps our analysts when they're looking at a case of potentially suspicious transactions. And typically a transaction or a number of transactions end up generating an alert. And that sort of starts that whittling process I talked about a minute ago. What CogI is really doing is it's extracting all the relevant data features to bring together a view that presents to the investigator and says, this inherently looks like things that we think are okay, or it inherently looks like something that I can't really explain. And it gives the investigator then evidence and basis for decision. So the idea is not to replace the decision of the investigator, but rather to augment the human in actually making better decisions and to understand the comparison between across all this vast number of investigations and data points. And CogI is doing that, making its recommendations, having learned how our expert investigators would approach a similar set of information. So it's a sort of supervised model underneath that. So these tools are kind of improving our ability to find signs of potential financial crime and also to help us get better then at investigating those signs. At the same time, though, and this is the bit I said at the beginning, it's a bit more nuanced than that. This is the part for the nuance. It's not really removing the need or replacing the need for kind of human judgment and decision making and how we think about those issues. So given that, given all those benefits, the reality is we have to continue to work in the complex framework that a large international bank operates. So just like every bank, we're very closely regulated by lots of different regulators. Those regulators have a variety of views at times around how we do what we do and what can and should be done. And perhaps more importantly, we exist as an entity to serve our customers. And they need to be confident about the way we're handling our data. They need to be willing to understand the purpose of the approach and why we're doing it, which means we have to be able to explain in plain terms how we're fulfilling our obligation to handle their data ethically and in a way they would expect, and help explain clearly what it is we're trying to accomplish with that. So in that sense, strong governance and transparency, explainability are critical to what we're doing. We can't really rely on sort of black box technologies. And we talked a bit about this yesterday, but if there's kind of one recommendation I have for folks looking to build tools, it's got to be explainable to us so that it can be explainable to all the people we need to explain it to. Because fundamentally, if it's a black box, we can't explain in those plain terms to our customers. They wouldn't want it, they wouldn't accept it, and frankly, neither would our regulators. So our core development principles then kind of spring from those nuanced obligations, which is first, how do we use the simplest tool for the job? So it isn't, as much a question of how do we go use the most sophisticated technique, the most cutting edge math that we can think of, and how do we bring that to bear? We do try to do that in the places we should, and when we have problems that need those techniques, we absolutely use them. But it's a question of, what is the simplest way we can do what it is we're trying to accomplish? And how do we do that in a way that doesn't add new layers of complexity to what is already a complex approach at an organization our size and scale? And you can imagine 8 billion transactions, 66 countries, 39 million clients. There's a reasonable amount of complexity in operating that kind of approach. So let me wrap up then by kind of talking about where this might sort of take us into the future. The first thing is, we at HSBC, we really believe that new technology and the way we use it enables us and the wider banking sector to make a significant impact in the fight on financial crime. As I talked about, we are well embarked now on doing this in a new and what we're pretty convinced is a fundamentally better way. And the tools like AI and machine learning give us an ability to manage the large volumes of data we have and greater insight, back to thinking about my function as a function that does insight, greater insight into the activities and suspicious transactions that we have. And this in turn enables us to deliver better information to law enforcement so they can better target the kind of activity that has the real human impact that we're trying to counter when you think about human trafficking and narco trafficking and these kind of terrible societal ills. But at the same time, the better insight into our customers and better understanding of where the risks really lie actually enable us to provide better services to people who right now may be seen as too great a risk for people in the financial system. And that, I think, is an interesting kind of point to maybe take into the discussion in terms of if we can develop our new technology, if we can do it in the right way with the right governance and the right oversight, we'll not only be helping law enforcement target these societal ills, we'll also be helping our customers and wider society, one, by making it harder for criminals to operate, and two, hopefully by allowing more folks in an inclusive way into the banking system. So maybe I'll pause there, and happy to have the discussion. Thanks very much.
Do you want to join us for the panel? Great. So we're just going to move into our panel discussion now. We'll just give everyone a moment to come on the stage. I am going to sit on this end so that I can see the clock. So welcome. My name's Heather Adams. I'm a managing director at Accenture, where I focus on resilience risk and helping our financial services clients prevent financial crime. Welcome to the rest of our panelists. We have James Varga, CEO of the ID company, Emily Orton, CMO of Darktrace, Martin Goodson, Chief Scientist and CEO of Evolution AI, and Husayn Kassai, Onfido CEO and founder. Thanks, everyone. So we're going to talk a bit more around the topic of identity, financial crime, and security. Financial crime and security are of increasing concern to governments and commercial enterprises alike. An estimated $2 trillion a year is laundered through the global financial system, and the cost of cybercrime is growing by more than 10% per year. It's now an estimated value at risk of $5.2 trillion globally over the next 5 years. Key to identifying networks of organized criminals, hacktivists, or nation-state attackers is to have an awareness of the identity of individuals and companies involved in transactions and engaging with our organizations as customers. To address this, new technologies and techniques are emerging to help better identify customers and counterparties and to identify threats within networks of people and transactions. We'll try and explore today the opportunities presented by some of those new techniques and some of the challenges in applying them to those areas. So maybe kicking off with a bit of a discussion around identity. James?
Okay. Well, I guess, first of all, identity is a very big topic, isn't it? So what we're really talking about here in terms of financial crime is identity verification, as we were talking earlier. I think it's identity verification that is one of the key points in the world of fraud and financial crime, because it's the point of attack that a lot of fraudsters have. It's the point of benefit, really. And fraudsters are incredibly, as we see with the numbers that increase every year, incredibly organized, incredibly sophisticated. They collaborate. They're better funded and more motivated than anybody in the industry to singly prevent that. I don't know if that's fair, Marc, but I think what we see in the market is an incredible amount of effort to get that financial benefit from either impersonation or direct fraud or money laundering or whatever the case is. And I think what we've got here is a few different perspectives on different aspects of preventing some of that risk with very different solutions. Ourselves, we live in a world of open banking and PSD2, so we try to help people use bank data to solve some of this problem. Almost as Marc described, leveraging that financial profile and that behavior to understand whether the person is real or not, but it's only one component. Any one component is always at risk. So combining these things together, which I think is probably one of the next phases of identity and identity verification, at least until we get to a point of centralizing that onto the consumer and switching the model and putting the individual at the heart of that conversation. Until we get to that point, I think the best that we can do is maybe collaborate, combine these different sources, social networks, whatever you want to call them, and try and find other ways to pinpoint the fraud activity. There's been some incredibly sophisticated activity in the last few years. A couple of years ago, and I think it was Florida in the States, a set of 10,000 bank accounts that were set up transferring money between each other to create false identities, personas, things that look like real activity. That's the level of effort I think fraudsters are going through in terms of identity and financial crime and that sort of thing. It's an incredibly difficult challenge for most people today, and that's, I guess, where we link into AI and machine learning and using more sophisticated methods to get access to more data sources, pull that together and find a way to deal with it.
Thanks, James. Can I ask Husayn maybe to add to that?
Sure. Good morning. So it's already been said, identity theft is the largest crime and the fastest growing crime in the world. And as Mark mentioned, of the estimated 5% of the world GDP that is laundered money, less than 1% of that is predicted or estimated to have been caught. So if this were any other industry where 99% of the funds kind of cheat the system and get away with it, we have a 99% failure rate. You wouldn't accept that in any other industry. And these are the funds that are used for human trafficking, drug trafficking, terrorist financing. It's as dark as it gets. So we have a long way to go. And so at Onfido, we set up the company 7 years ago. We power about 1,500 businesses who are remotely onboarding customers. So if you're an online remittance platform, for instance, and you're registering new users, at the point of registration, the user is asked to take a photo of their government's ID and a recording of their face. And then we use machine learning to verify that that ID seems genuine and that the photo on the ID matches the person's face. And the reason why we're kind of in the reason why the identity ecosystem is broken and getting worse is because on the one hand, it's not really scalable to meet everyone face-to-face as you're onboarding them. It's not an easy experience. It's not frictionless. There are convenience issues there. And alternatively, over the last 150 years, we've relied on credit bureaus to help us essentially verify individuals. And the credit bureau model is ultimately a centralized database of everyone's date of birth, name, address, and so on. But it's no longer fit for purpose. And I learned at an early age that it's an important institution because it underpins our global financial economy, but it doesn't really, it doesn't help fraud in that businesses are paying the credit bureaus to stop fraud, but the credit bureaus are unintentionally making it worse by aggregating everyone's data, the data that fraudsters need to cheat systems, and then getting hacked. So they're not helping, which is a bit of a problem. And that's why, hopefully, these new solutions are here to start to sort of combat this large and growing problem. They don't intentionally sell data to fraudsters, but they make it worse unintentionally. I hope they don't anyway. If you have any information, you should share. We were worried that this might not be a debate, but please do. Go ahead.
Martin, where do you think we are?
So let's introduce this whole concept of know your customer, KYC. So this is where a bank or other financial services institution is going to need to establish who they're transacting with. So if you open a new bank account, like let's say a business bank account for your firm, the bank is going to need to go through this whole process of KYC. It's a really laborious process, very document intensive. They may have hundreds of documents to read, just really simple stuff like they're going to need to look at company's house to check that you're legitimate. They're also going to read your website to make sure that it seems to be that everything checks out that you say on your application form. It takes a really, really long time. Humans are just not very good at reading thousands of documents quickly, and sometimes you really need to pinpoint a piece of information that it's not really very obvious from reading the documentation. It's boring, it's really slow, it's really expensive, it's a really bad customer experience because it might take the customer weeks to open their bank account. But it's generally considered in the industry, it's a necessary evil. This is really the cornerstone of the whole fight against money laundering, terrorist financing, and so on. And it's supposed to be the thing that stops everything. And so this is the reason why over the last 5 years, banks have increased their compliance workforce by about tenfold. So I think I heard an estimate that HSBC's 10% of their staff are in compliance, and a large chunk, I don't know if that's true, but a large chunk of them will be doing this kind of KYC stuff. However, the most important thing for everyone to remember is that none of this works. As has already been mentioned a couple of times, only about 1% of money laundering proceeds are actually detected. Everything is just getting through. The criminals are all getting away with it all of the time. And we think, so my company builds software for reading documents. That's all it does. It just reads documents so that humans don't need to. It can make some decisions in much the same way that a human would on a document. We think that if humans didn't have to spend so much time doing the donkey work of reading these really boring documents, they could spend a lot more time doing the investigative work that humans are just much better at. And humans are creative. The criminals are definitely creative. So the compliance professionals need to use what they're really good at, which is being creative as well.
Marc, do you want to react to that?
Yeah, sure. I'll take that. There you go. I'll take that. I think those points that came out are exactly the kind of right way to think about the problem, and kind of allude back to sort of what I was suggesting in terms of, we take a bit of our data at a point in the customer journey, and then we try to build systems to look at that without really considering, well, what else do you know at that point? What else can you bring to bear, and how do you bring that together? And certainly, the point around, look, if there is a repetitive process that's about pattern recognition, to the extent we can give that job to a machine, not only will the machine fundamentally be better at it than the human will, it's actually a more engaging process for the human to then deal on the back end with, right, now I actually know something, where do I go from there? And the point about making the point of the human decision come sort of later in the process, I think is a key one there. So, a lot of what we see these tools as doing is dealing with the sheer volume of it, so that by the time you're asking a person to make an investigative decision, they've got a much more complete picture, and they're not going around saying, yeah, but why is that field not quite filled out properly, and where did that data come from? If that's all dealt with, they then get to look at the problem and say, right, now what is this actually telling me about financial crime, and what do I know I should be looking for? And a machine can do some of that, but as you're saying, a human can be much better and much more creative. And I do think certainly what we're seeing in the fraud space is creative fraudsters who want to find a way and are highly motivated to beat it, because if they've got a 99% success rate, you can see why they'd be motivated.
Thanks. And Emily, we talked quite a lot about fraud and financial crime so far, but from a security perspective, the threats that are out there are much broader, aren't they?
I think we've heard a picture of complexity in the comments so far. Firstly, the threat landscape is getting much more sophisticated, as we've heard. You've got both targeted attacks that are probably pretty small in scale and going after specific individuals within an organization. And then we've seen things like, indiscriminate, very fast attacks. WannaCry a couple of years ago, where it's the scale and the speed is just too fast and too large for human teams to respond to. We're now going to see these machine speed attacks getting very sophisticated and getting very targeted. And you're already seeing that in the security space, where you have essentially sort of prototype AI programs being written for specific individuals, and they're going out at scale across an organization. And each one is customized. So I think clearly the sophistication is going to continue to increase. And we talked obviously a lot about criminals, but you also need to think about insiders and their potential to get involved in criminal activity as well. And so, how do you spot malicious from benign? Ultimately, organizations are dealing with, as I said, complexity, and there's lots of incremental improvements we can make to, lock windows, shut doors, stop, authenticate. But I think the shift we've seen in the last 5 years or so has been that you have to accept that you're going to have malicious activity on your networks, and you don't know where it's going to rear its head. We have remote working, we have cloud systems. Increasingly, a big problem is the Internet of Things. At Darktrace, we've seen for example, a fish tank get compromised. The attackers actually got onto compromised a part of the underlying hardware in the fish tank, and actually it was an entertainment company, and they actually jumped to the corporate network of this entertainment company. We're looking at the high roller database of the casino and looking for high net worth individuals and getting banking information. We've seen we had another example of this. Was an insider incident where we found some malicious activity across the systems. We ended up looking in this server room and finding this particular device that was abnormal. We couldn't find it. We saw it on the network, right? We saw it on our interface. We ended up finding underneath the floorboards in the server room, there was a server that had been plugged in. IT team had no idea. It was connected to the corporate internet, and it was actually mining for Bitcoin. So, it's so complex today. So I think we've already seen the shift where organisations are having to look across the organisation. Think about it like a modern city where you can't control everyone that's going to get in, but you have to monitor it. And so we've already seen that financial organisations are already implementing that continuous monitoring across all of their systems, whether that's your SaaS programs or obviously your financial trading systems, etc. I think the next piece is where you see AI. We talked about sort of the issues around AI and false positives and things. You're going to see AI being trusted to actually take an action against a cyber attack. Mm-hmm. And that's the fundamental shift, because that means it has to be trusted enough that you think that AI is going to take the right decision when it finds a threat. That's the whole category of autonomous response, as it's known. And that's kind of the new piece that I think is going to be the big shift. And humans are going to have to trust it enough to actually prefer. You get to the point where you prefer the AI to respond to a machine speed attack when you're not in the office, as opposed to leaving it to escalate. So it's quite an interesting time for AI at the moment.
So lots of opportunities there. I guess with the shift, we've already mentioned the shift in big data and the processing power that now provides. The specific advanced analytical solutions are being deployed, perhaps to some of the example Marc's given, but then more autonomous AI is perhaps the next opportunity step. What other opportunities do we see? Do you want to add something? Anyone?
What other opportunities? I don't know. I guess there's a fundamental question on whether we've lost the battle or not already, and whether fraudsters are always outstripped. If you look at the pace of fraud increasing over the last, say, 10 or 20 years, they've always beat us. So the opportunity surely then has to be in how do we beat the fraudsters?
Right.
And any one-point solution, it probably doesn't work. So maybe more network views, associated sort of higher level collaborations between different either organizations and working together to kind of solve these pains, or maybe it's a fundamental flip in the model completely. Maybe as an industry we've completely lost the battle, and then we're all spending as organizations or companies or individuals the same amount of effort to solve the top layer of the problem, the top 20%, the almost superficial part of the problem. Maybe at some point what we need to do is stop trying to solve the problem for the individual to protect the consumer, because that's who's ultimately at risk. And maybe at some point we need to flip that model and put the individual in control of more and more of their data, give them the keys, and empower them to centralize some of that risk and some of that management. I don't know.
I think Husayn wanted to jump in there.
So, well, partly to disagree with Martin in that all criminals cheat the systems all the time. If they did that, we'd be out of work. But they are definitely sophisticated and getting worse. So specifically as for opportunities, so with us, when we entered the industry, it was commonplace for providers to say, we catch 100% of fakes. And the first thing that we did was tell everyone, no, they don't. No one does. And if they're telling you they are, then you should rethink what they're saying. And that this should be thought of as an antivirus option, where no provider can ever say they catch all the viruses. What you need the opportunity is to cooperate and work together to reduce that. And that fundamentally, when a fraudster is trying to cheat a bank, and they're caught or deterred, they're not going to go home and change their idea and change their mind and not be a fraud. They're going to go to the bank 2, bank 3. So the way that we've done it is feedback loops. So out of every 10,000 individuals that sign up to a client of ours, on average, about 200 will be trying to cheat the system or will be fraudsters. And of those, 3 successfully make it through. So we catch about 200 and we miss about 3. And we're very open with clients because they kind of know. Because their own manual teams would miss far more. And other options also miss the majority. So what we explain is that of the 200 that we catch, then often when we're unsure, we have feedback loops with our internal teams. So if a passport is stained, we don't know if that's because it was in the washing machine or it was a sophisticated fraudster. But when a human double checks, they're able to reduce the false positives and they're training the models so the models get better over time. But equally, we tell our clients, as and when we miss a sophisticated fake, you need to alert us, so we use those samples to build the next version. So sitting in the middle of all these different businesses and using machine learning and using labeling and human assistance so that you're continuously building on the feedback loops and improving. And that's why, for the first time, we're actually having an effective fight back. I mean, we're a client of Darktrace, and it's exactly the same model. Like every time one of your clients has an attack, your models get better so that you prevent, I don't want to speak for you, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I hope it is, that's what we're paying for. Tell me if it's not, we'll ask for a discount. But in the second and third client instance, you kind of get better at detecting that. So that's the power of machine learning, essentially.
So this is a different point. I'm not going to respond to that directly, but I think a fundamental shift needs to happen now, because if you look at something like the Russian laundromat scheme. So the Russian laundromat scheme was a scheme to launder $80 billion from Russia, mainly through Moldova, and into the Western money system, actually mostly through London and through the UK. So this was a network of at least 2,000 firms which were fraudulent and who opened up business banking accounts and conducted all of this money laundering. So the current system for detecting this is that you have individual KYC analysts reading the KYC information for these 2,000. I mean, 2,000 is probably a fraction of the reality. It's probably 10,000 at least. Individual KYC analysts will read the documentation, say, oh, that checks out. I'm going to onboard them into the bank. Everything seems to be fine. They're going to go through this KYC process. It all looks good. What they don't realize is that because we're dealing with a network, it's a ring of criminals. Most of the KYC information is kind of identical because they're just copying and pasting. You know, they're not that sophisticated yet because they don't need to be, because the banks aren't, because they're not joining the dots between the different organizations that they're dealing with. So for me, I think that's the next step, and that's something that's opened up to AI that's just not open to humans. Humans are incapable of dealing with 10,000 data points and to make a decision. They just can't do it.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's, you know, going back to the opportunities and you know, have we all already lost and should we just go home? I don't think that. I'm actually fairly optimistic about this kind of approach, but I think it speaks to exactly kind of what you were alluding to, which is the need for sort of design thinking in the space and say, look, what is it that we're trying to do? Because fundamentally, if you're trying to catch a criminal network one account at a time just by looking at their onboarding data, you're going to miss things. And if you're fundamentally trying to then find that network one transaction at a time, you're going to miss things. And if you're not having conversations across with other peers about, well, what are you seeing and how is that working, you won't know all the things you need to know. I think each one of those has pluses and minuses that we have to think about how we implement and how we put in. And you know, the use of machine learning, certainly, you know, there are places where you'll trust a machine to make a decision because the speed of it, particularly in the cyberspace, and you know, there's a lot of crossover between cyber and fraud, where you'll have a machine maybe make a decision, and other places you very much wouldn't. And so all of that to me suggests that what's needed in this space is a bit more broader design thinking about the fundamental purpose of how we're tackling the problem itself, and saying, look, there's a piece of this that can be detected at account opening. There's a piece of this that can be detected using machine learning where you can just stop things because you probably don't want to see them. There's a piece that's going to rely on human investigation to figure it out. What I don't think we've done collectively as an industry is really step back and say, okay, what are those pieces and where are the pluses and minuses of that? And and how do we then, having done that design thinking, explain it to the huge stakeholder community around our customers and regulators, and to say this is why we're doing the things that we're doing.
Yeah, so maybe, Emily, did you want to just add to that? You were nodding vigorously.
I was just going to say, I think the opportunity, and we kind of often understate the achievements of the industry so far. You know, it's quite a bleak picture when you read the news, and it is a bleak picture, and I think fraudsters are still making a lot of money, still lucrative area to go into. But, you know, AI is now responding to a cyber threat every 3 seconds worldwide. That's not sort of reported on, but it's being caught at an early stage, you know, before it even gets to, you know, your critical data systems, preferably. So it's really about catching things early. It's not about catching everything that's getting in. It's about catching things early, taking a probabilistic approach. And, you know, there is a lot of talk about AI, machine learning. I heard in the keynote about, you know, the problem of rules-based approaches where you're going to miss things or you're going to have exceptions to rules. So really this idea of a self-learning AI, and whatever AI you're deploying in your organization, it needs to understand your organization. It's going to be very different to another one. And so, you know, the way Darktrace works is it's essentially building up a bespoke understanding of your organization. If it's machine learning that's too reliant on certain data sets that need to be constantly looked at and constantly updated and tweaked and configured, you know, that's going to be much more burdensome approach, and it's going to have stuff's going to get through. So you really want that system working really hard for you and actually taking the feedback, self-learning, learning from everything it's seeing. We're really going to need a self-learning approach when you look at kind of the future of attacks and potentially AI being inserted into those attacks.
Yeah. So if technology and data are not really the constraints now, what are the challenges to being more effective and being further ahead of the criminals in this area? Is it collaboration that's required, or is it something else? You can start since you have the mic.
So collaboration. I think there's a big piece of you know, stakeholder communication and joining up the whole organization. Security is starting to be seen as a business, you know, a board level issue, business issue, but, you know, you kind of really need to start there before you've even perhaps, you know, thinking about your technology stack is, do you have engagement at the C level? Do you have this as a board level issue? And, you know, right from employee awareness through to the kind of senior stakeholders. So yeah, collaboration is a big piece. I think, you know, we are much more aware about cybersecurity now. And I think, you know, there's no silver bullet, so everyone needs to understand that. And at that point, you can actually celebrate some of the achievements and you know, get your whole business behind a more kind of probabilistic approach where you're just getting much, you know, incrementally better at catching things early rather than having this kind of, is your business secure, yes or no? You know, that's not really a realistic question anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of constraints, there are a fair number, but I think one of them is first around information sharing and thinking about what information can be shared between and among jurisdictions at a client level, at an institution level, and at a jurisdiction level, and you get different answers to each of those in different jurisdictions and across. So that's the first kind of hurdle or constraint is, can we even bring the data together to do the kind of work we would want to do, and then to what extent can we and what can't we? And then second, I wouldn't term it a constraint, more an obligation. We have obligations that frankly criminals don't, and we care deeply about how we use our customers' data and making sure that what we're doing is ethically correct and looking at it across the wide variety of our customers. Criminals don't care if their models are biased, and I think when you start thinking about that, there's an inherent asymmetry in the ecosystem that you're working in that isn't. It's not a constraint. It's an obligation that we should have and welcome having, but it's a question of how do you then, within that asymmetry, actually respond quickly enough to have the impact you're trying to have.
Just to add, if there are two other things. One is an attitude thing. So we're lucky to have about 240 people on the team working towards our mission. And we explain at the interview stage, we're not a compliance tool. there are many of them out there. You should go and apply. But we are a fraud detection tool. And we are here to stop these bad actors. And the good news is there are many of them. And so there's going to be a tough task. So that from day one, that's essentially the fundamental focus. Because there's a difference. I mean, you can use a credit bureau model and you're fully compliant. But it's about stopping the bad actors. The second thing is an awareness, where specifically, like this is, to your point on collaboration, businesses are now collaborating. They're indirectly or implicitly collaborating, but because of deploying software such as Darktrace, and then behind the scenes, they're kind of all sharing. Similar with us, the good thing is that no personal data needs to be shared. In our use case, if we're learning what a New York driving license looks like, we don't need to store any personal data. We just know what patterns, the fonts, and so on. So we can detect fakes just by learning from that. So it's the awareness of sharing that is happening now in the private sector because there's no alternative. But from the government perspective, it sounds good, and you get headlines when you have 20 more police officers walking the streets to stop a 15-year-old stealing a packet of cigarettes from your local grocery store. But really, if they were aware of the billions going through the cyber crime and other networks, they'd be deploying those resources at the Met Police and elsewhere that are counter-attacking these cyber networks and fraud rings. Just because I can tell you, as far as the Met Police goes, those fundings are being cut. And it is in many ways the biggest bang for the buck to stop actual, not all crime is bad crime, but significant crime if more is invested. And that's only going to happen if the public at large are aware of the magnitude and seriousness of the large crime that is invisible in the sense that it's digital.
Sorry, I just want one quick sort of specific question. You said there it's a fraud detection tool. It's not a compliance tool. I'm just wondering how you're differentiating those, because we don't actually see them as all that different.
So fraud detection is, you could think of as a table, and a subset to that is compliance. So if you are signing up to a remote bank, that bank or an online bank, detecting that your date of birth, name, and address exists on a credit bureau is sufficient. But what we are doing, for instance, over and above that, is to show a government ID, is to show that the face of the person matches the photo on the ID, is to do a liveness check on the face. So the liveness check is, you don't have to do, that's not in legislation anywhere. The majority are now switching those kind of things on because they themselves want to stop the bad actors. It's going over and above what you legally are required to, is my main point.
Yeah, that's right. That's the thing I'm drawing out is, when you say compliance tool, you mean that thing that banks need to do to minimally fulfill their compliance. And yeah, and we've got lots of tools that go beyond that. Yeah, that's okay.
Great. So I want to leave some time for audience questions. Perhaps before I do that, I'll just ask Martin and James quickly. What does the future look like? Martin, maybe you go first.
Horrible. You know, I spoke about the Russian laundromat. That's at least 2,000 accounts that have been opened. Probably when the Russian laundromat happened, which was a couple of years ago, you probably needed human beings to write the forms out. You probably don't need humans to write the forms now. You could write something that looks quite good with natural language generation software now. So probably the criminals are just going to scale up another level. You'll be looking at 200,000 accounts being opened by machines rather than by human beings now. So I think it's going to get harder.
I'm going to step forward slightly and be a little bit more positive about it, because I do think there's light at the end of the tunnel, and I think AI. Sorry, excuse me. I think AI is going to contribute quite heavy to that. I think we're at the edge of. Someone described it to me the other day as a data apocalypse. That our personal data, which actually powers a lot of the risk that we're talking about, the crime that we're trying to prevent against, is based on name, address, date of birth, details, account number, sort codes, whatever, that are being used to drive this fraudulent behavior or email account. I think at some point we're going to get a critical phase in that evolution where we lose control enough that we have to do something about it. I'm a big believer in the self-sovereign model. I think consumers should own their data. I think GDPR is a fantastic thing. I think the only way to really solve this problem en masse is to empower the individual. That's a little ways off. I think until then, if we start to collaborate, if we start to use some of these tools, you said the data and the technology is there. I think it's kind of there. We have to learn how to use it. We have to understand it still. That's the middle ground, The AI, the machine learning, the techniques that we use have to develop enough. We have to get enough trust in them, to rely on them, to let them do things for us, that'll take a big part of the bandwidth away so that we can then focus on the harder part of the problem. A lot of that's around the data and the personal data is being used and how we can understand that, how we can understand behavior across sectors and regions and so forth. And if we can do that to build up a better picture at the same time as starting to move the controls back to the consumer, then maybe we will crack the nut at some point.
Thank you. Would anyone in the audience like to ask a question?
It's got to be one or two. Come on.
Hi, a question for Marc. HSBC, you've talked about trying to share data, but are you looking at joining things like the Cyber Defence Alliance, which is British banks sharing that sort of data?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not quite sure where we are in terms of participating in the Cyber Defense Alliance. On consortiums generally and kind of collaborating in general, I think, we absolutely participate in a number of kind of information sharing consortiums, both in the UK and in other jurisdictions where we operate. I think, there's kind of two ways you can do that I think are really useful. One is in the detailed consortium, if you can get the right information protections in place and you can actually share the sort of detailed granular data is one. More broadly, and it's more easier to share. It's easier to share at this level. Is to then have a discussion around typologies and what are we seeing and how do we share that kind of information. And we do quite a lot of that formally and informally in a number of mechanisms that exist. So the Cyber Defense Alliance, I'm not actually entirely sure specifically on that. I'll have to go check. But certainly in the consortiums, and within the UK, there's a joint money laundering intelligence task force run by the UK government, which we participate in, as do a number of other institutions. And that is around that. How are we understanding the threat that's being posed by fraudsters and cyber criminals?
Hi, my name is Osborne from Horizon. I just wanted to know your view on fintech banks like Monzo, Starling Bank. What do you guys think about their security systems? Because most people think they are enhancing fraudsters basically because they are fintech banks. So what do you guys think?
So we work with the majority of fintechs and online banks. So that was the impression 3 or 4 years ago when these online banks started. The assumption was, how can you have an online bank? Fraud is tough as it is. The assumption was that if you're purely online, fraud is going to make it easier for fraudsters. And what's happened over the last 2 or 3 years in particular is that mainstream banks have seen these online banks are able to scale as effectively and control risk and fraud to the same standards as mainstream banks can, in part because the underlying assumption was seeing someone in a bank branch with a human eye is somehow superior to what digital machine learning powered technologies are able to do. But the fact of the matter is that it's been scientifically proven that at scale, machine learning models can do a better job of facial detection and ID detection than the human eye can. So we've been able to prove that these online sort of technologies are not only much more convenient for consumers to sign up, but as secure, if not more secure. And the fact that over the last 2 years, the mainstream banks have spun up their own digital banks or invested in the digital banks is kind of proving that the latest trend of technologies is sort of assisting the next wave of online solutions. And that benefits everyone because it streamlines costs, it enables access to the bottom of the pyramid, it has a much better customer experience, and so on.
Hi, thank you. Linda Knowles from HSBC. So we've spoken a lot this morning about how AI is used in a positive way to learn about what criminal activities are happening. Have we thought about the prospect of AI using in a very negative way? So obviously, if AI is able to machine learn, etc., etc., how are we thinking about the defense of our systems against negative AI?
Well, I've already mentioned one thing, which is natural language generation. I think it's very new, a new field really. There are state-of-the-art developments every month. At the moment, it's extremely difficult to detect a machine-written piece of text compared to a human-written piece of text. I mean, the technology is developing, but it's an active research topic.
Yeah, and I think the future is AI on AI attacks within corporate networks and industrial networks and cloud networks, etc. So, it's a different future we're facing. We're already seeing the beginnings of a very sophisticated computer code. It's not at scale, but it's only inevitable that, as you say, attackers are going to use the latest technologies and start launching for example, extremely credible spear phishing. Very difficult to distinguish because they know how you talk to certain colleagues or they know how you interact in personal email communications, which might be different. They'll have access to social networks, be able to glean information and put out something that for any busy person or not, to be honest, it's going to be very difficult. I think there used to be a sort of thing like, oh, you're a bit stupid if you click on a link, but I don't think that's true. We can't just write it off as employee training. The other thing you're going to see is that within the network, once they get in, they're going to be much better at hiding under the radar, going under the radar of your traditional security tools on the network. So very challenging. It's essentially whoever's algorithm is better is going to win that battle. We're already seeing it to an extent, and we'll definitely see it more. And I think that ultimately you have to get onto the forefront, and a lot of organisations are doing that. They're getting ahead. They have to be prepared for that future because they're going to be caught out if they get hit with some of these attacks.
So one last question.
Hi, it's Philippi for Marc. My question is different from fraud, credit risk, marketing, or insurance, where you have clear performance data. Whatever definition you give in performance, the bad and the good, you don't have that in financial crime and money laundering. So my question is how you train your data if you don't have that, and what the limitations it creates for the use of AI in financial crime.
Thank you. I just want to take a second to appreciate the question because it's a very, very good question and one that we really struggle with, which is, just to elaborate on a second, in fraud, you get a very clear 0-1 outcome. It either was the customer or it wasn't. They either stole the money or they didn't. And if it wasn't and they did, well, then that was fraud and we can go look for that. In money laundering, it's almost the opposite problem, right? The money launderer is trying to not be detected. So the fact that you didn't detect it could mean you didn't have it, or it could mean that the launderer was successful in not being detected. And so I think the way we go about that, it's a number of ways. There's no one solution to that. One is, we talked earlier about kind of consortiums and how we're talking to folks about known typologies and what things look for. What things to look for, and so we're doing some of that. I think you've got outcome data of a sort. You've got the things that you filed in all the places and jurisdictions that you filed. You've got the investigations that you've looked at and said these are beyond simply filing because we had an obligation to file. We actually know this was a more serious case. I think you've got some of those. And then I think you've also got, and this is where it becomes, I think, better at a machine learning level, and frankly, better as you get more sophisticated in your techniques. You may not have overall 0-1 outcomes at a top level, but you can say this is a known typology that heavily associates with a particular kind of financial crime. And so you can think of, if you start to break that down, of, okay, what does it really take to be a human trafficker? Well, I have to move people across borders. I have to move money. I have to establish places where I'm bringing people in. You can begin to think of what that looks like, and you can start to target the typology. So it's a sophisticated, nuanced answer that doesn't really have the nice, clean 0-1. And I really do wish all the money launderers would say, hey, we've gotten one past you. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work like that. So we try to do everything we can to try to train those models.
So you definitely don't have a 0 or 1 kind of label, but there is data. It's mostly unstructured, though. There are suspicious activity reports and other documentation. It's just not in a nice structured form that you can just read from a database and run a machine learning model on. You need to do some work. But now, with machine reading technologies, you can structure the data. You can read the suspicious activity report and label it with some of the typology information and do it in a two-step process.
Thank you. So I'm afraid that draws us to the end. Thank you all for being a wonderful audience, and thank you to our panelists, Marc, Husayn, Martin, Emily, and James. Thank you.